So what we're looking at are some disses, words that begin with dis, that can keep us off of the track that God has called us to. And so kind of it starts with that, right? I believe that God has called each and every one of us to a specific path. He's got a plan for each and every person in this room. And there are things that we can do to further that. And there are also things that we can do that kind of, that make that more difficult than it should be. I'm generally my own worst enemy. Like, have you noticed that? It's not often that it's other people who are causing me the problems that I deal with. Generally, my problems are just that, my problems. Have you noticed that? And so these are some of the disses. Like, for example, last week we talked about disappointment, how disappointment can get us off the track. What happens with disappointment is, again, like such an emotional thing, right? Something doesn't happen or something doesn't go like you think that it should. And as a result of the disappointment, what we do is we allow that to keep us from staying on the track that God has called us to, or we allow it to fester. I think disappointment is one of those things that lingers longer than it should. And basically, it's essentially that, right? It's we have the choice to decide how long that thing stays around and what we do with it. And so that's what we talked about last week. This week, the dis that we're going to look at that has the potential to get us off track in our journey towards God is being disengaged. Disengaged. Have you ever been disengaged when you should have been engaged? Right? And so many different areas of our life. And so what we'll do is, this is just for those of you who are definition people, this one's for you. This is probably the most genius observation you're ever going to experience. To be disengaged means to be not engaged. It's good, right? I know, mind blown, exactly. So to be disengaged means that you're not engaged. And so I think this is it's not a difficult concept to comprehend, right? We understand what it means to be engaged, and we understand what it means to be not engaged. But we're going to get into kind of the specifics of how being disengaged can derail us from this track that we've been talking about. And so there are a lot of different places we could dive in on this, and some of them would be really good. So what I did is I compiled a list of like honorable mentions that we're going to kind of just breeze through. They're worth mentioning, but we're going to focus on just 2 for today. Let me give you an example. Being disengaged from prayer, right? Have you ever, this is what's so frustrating about prayer sometimes. It's like, I'll never think about the things that I'm thinking about unless I'm praying. For example, I never really think about washing my vehicle unless I start praying. And then I'm like, man, I need to wash my vehicle when I'm... Right, so being disengaged from prayer is not helpful. Being disengaged from God's word, not helpful. It's hard to grow what you don't know, right? And I think what happens so often, like this is such a strange thing to think about. Like in Christianity, it's like people, they want to grow, they want to know Jesus more, and they want to be more like him and reflect him more accurately, but they don't engage with his word so that they can do those things. Being disengaged from church. I think you know where I stand on this one, right? Not just because I'm a pastor of a church, but I think that church is such an important thing in our lives. I go to church so often, people are like, well, you go to church because you have to go to church. No, I want to go to church. Like, I really, really appreciate church and what we get to experience and the corporate gathering where we can, like, this is the way that I've always viewed, maybe not always, but this is the way that I view church. It's like we can have all of the things that we go through throughout the week, and like you can have ups and downs and highs and lows and hard and challenges, and we get to come together on Sunday, and it's almost like those things just don't matter, right? We have some time to corporately focus on the things that actually matter. So don't be disengaged from church, honorable mention. Again, right? So I also think it's worth noting here that being disengaged doesn't necessarily mean being disconnected. I think those are 2 different things. So being disengaged is not necessarily being disconnected. Sometimes what we do, when we're disengaged, we're still there. We're just not as there as we should be, right? It's not like we're completely removing ourselves from, prayer or reading God's word or church. Sometimes we go just to go, and we're not actually getting everything out of it that we could and should be getting. And so again, as good as it would be to kind of dive into these and help us to navigate this particular dis, we're going to focus on a couple of different aspects of this and things that we tend to, areas where we tend to disengage, where we should absolutely not disengage. You good with that? 2 of them. First one is this, and the title for the point. The title is disengagement. That's clever as everything, right? But the point is, the first point is community disengagement. Community disengagement. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I already said church. Isn't that the same thing? And I don't think they're necessarily the same thing at all. So to me, church is a vehicle through which community happens. Church and community are two very different things, right? It's almost like kind of the next step or the next level of church. Like church is incredibly important, but the community that takes place as a result of us being part of a church is what is most important, right? Just showing up to a church doesn't necessarily mean that you are engaged with others in community. Like you could come to church and never really have any meaningful relationships, although God's intention is for us to come to church and have lots of meaningful relationships. And so the difference here is kind of the intentionality and then that nasty word vulnerability, where we have to be willing to let people in. We have to kind of put down some of the walls that we tend to put up. Does anybody else, like, I'm so cynical, and it is not always healthy. Anybody else do this? Anytime somebody, like, I meet somebody for the first time, I'm always like, what do you want? Like, what is your angle? What do you want? Is there anybody else that does that? And so I don't think that we get to the place where we have these deep and meaningful and purposeful relationships unless we're intentional and then we are willing to be vulnerable. True biblical community doesn't happen by accident. It's not, look, it would be so much easier if it's like we could just go to church on Sunday, and then as a result of that, very naturally and easily, and almost again by accident, it's like, oh, I woke up one day and I'm in community, and that's not really the way that it works at all. It takes effort and it takes courage. It's the difference between being there and being present, being engaged or being disengaged, and we talked a little bit about that last week. I've got an old lawnmower. I love my old lawnmower. It's a bad boy, and I just love that it's called a bad boy. I'm like, that's my bad boy. Right? I just feel so redneckish when I ride the thing. And so here's what's cool. My old lawnmower, it's a full-blown lawnmower. It's got the deck and the blades and the motor and all of the handles. It's a zero turns, right? All the cool stuff. But what's fascinating is that you can disengage I'm not going to get too far into this, and frankly, I don't know all of the specifics, but essentially there's a transaxle, and you can disengage the wheels. And now here's what's fascinating about this. It'll run, it'll still make all the noises. You can even turn the blade on, and still, the blade will be spinning, but it's not going to go anywhere if it's disengaged. And I think that's kind of the idea of relationships and community, right? It's like, and this is what happens to us in Christianity so often. Relationships help us to go further, faster. And what happens so often is like we do like the lawnmower would do if it wasn't engaged. It's like, well, you look the part, and you're kind of going through all of the motions, but you're missing some of the main. You're not going where you're supposed to be going. You're not going further, faster. You're not making any progress, and it's because we're not allowing these relationships to take place in our life, and then we're not getting into community like we should be getting into community, right? So don't be like the lawnmower that's not going anywhere. Be a lawnmower that's actually going somewhere. This is what's so fascinating. It's like you think about it, the things that Jesus said. I think any of the things that Jesus said, we should probably take very seriously, right, as followers of Jesus. Like if he said it, then we should consider it and what it looks like for us and what it means for us. And this is what he said, one of the things that he said about relationships, community, kind of our involvement with each other. John chapter 15, verses 12 and 13. He said, my command is this, love each other. Now, let me stop for just a second. He did not say, my suggestion is this, or it would be really nice if you would consider doing this for each other. Now, he said, my command is this, that you love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Now, what we tend to do, maybe you don't do this, but what I tend to do with this particular verse is I don't really think about other people when I read that. I think about Jesus when I read that, and I'm like, oh, yeah, greater love has no one than this, to lay down. But what he's telling us is essentially, I'm going to show you how this is supposed to be done. Jesus kind of, through this, was the template of what community and sacrifice and relationships should be. So, again, you kind of got to consider all the context here. He's like, love each other as I have loved you. And then he showed us how to do that. I'm going to give you just a couple more verses about community and obviously kind of, again, the relationships that we are called to. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 14, it says this, and we urge you, brothers and sisters. I told you guys last week, anytime it says brothers and sisters, I want to say brothers and sisters. I don't know why. I can't explain it, but that's where I'm at, right? And we urge you, brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle and disruptive. Okay, we're going to work through this. Warn those who are idle and disruptive, encourage the disheartened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. What I see, what seems to be taking place in this particular passage is there are kind of these three different categories of people. The idle and disruptive, warn them, like, hey, just be like, hey, that that's not you, right? That's not. I think what we're so afraid of is like we're afraid to correct people so often. And what I've come to learn over the years is encouragement isn't always like this super positive thing. Sometimes encouragement is, hey, you're better than what you're doing. You're better than the decisions that you're making. And so it's not being afraid. Again, it takes courage. It takes this willingness to put yourself out there and some intentionality. So we've got this group who are idle and disruptive. We're supposed to warn those. We're supposed to encourage those who are disheartened. We're supposed to help those who are weak. Isn't that kind of almost a comprehensive look at what it means to be in community? And then finally it finishes up with be patient with everybody. Because I need more patience with y'all, and y'all need more patience with me. And you know how it is, right? We just need more patience with everyone. And this is, again, just such a great and beautiful picture of what it looks like to be in community. Fascinating, although we know these things, so often what you find in Christianity is people that go to church, but they're not in community. Okay, Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, it says this, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Just think about the weight of that for just a moment, right? Like if you want to fulfill the law of Christ, if you want to do something that means so much to him, then you can carry each other's burdens and you will accomplish that end, right? You will fulfill the law of Christ by carrying each other's burdens. And so I think it's pretty clear. I think you get the idea. Like we are called to community, and yet so often, in spite of the fact that we're called to community, we're not necessarily engaged in community like we should be engaged in community. I have a sneaking suspicion, and you've probably seen this too. Statistically, this is proven, right? This bears out. Like there's data that is, kind of empirically compiled, and everybody's understanding. We are becoming increasingly isolated. It's fascinating, isn't it, that we're more connected than we've ever been, but we're more isolated than we've ever been? Which is kind of mind-blowing. I think what happens is we have substituted the number of connections with the depth of the connections. It's like we accept having very wide relationships, and we reject having these very deep relationships that we're actually called to. I've always thought about it like this. If you were ever in a real bind, if you were ever in a spot where you desperately needed help, how many of the wide connections are actually going to go out of their way to assist you? How many of them are going to drop what they're doing and come and, whatever sacrifice is necessary to help you get through? And so it's not about the width, it's about the depth, right? I'll give you an example, again, just of the community and the fact that we have to be willing to go a little bit deeper and sacrifice just a little bit more. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, a guy I've known for a really long time, but our relationship's honestly kind of been shallow. I mean, just like, hey, how you doing? How your mama doing? Right? Some of that stuff. But it was really cool because he reached out and he's like, man, I want to grow. I feel like I'm kind of stuck, and I'd really like to see some progress in my life. And so I thought about it kind of the whole idea. It's like we had a shallow relationship, and now we're going to take it to the next level. It's like speed dating, right? Just kidding. I felt like, y'all remember Kip from Napoleon Dynamite? He's like, yeah, I'm getting pretty T.O.'d. She hasn't sent me any. Anyway. So it was cool because kind of in that moment, we were able to take a shallow relationship and take it just a little bit deeper. And so it's been cool for me because it challenges me to really consider and think about other people more than I think about myself. And so now I'm trying to do a better job of just kind of, hey, once a week checking in. And so it was I sent him a text yesterday, as a matter of fact, and it was 3 questions. I was like, and I put them in like the numerical order, 1, 2, 3. And the first one was like, how you doing? Like for real, like not the pleasantries and not the formalities and not the fake stuff, right? Like how are you? I had a pastor one time, and it was so weird at the time, but now I think maybe that I'm older, I appreciate it so much more. So he would catch us in the parking lot all the time. Shelly and I, we'd be going to our cars, and for whatever reason, he was always in the parking lot. I don't understand, but that's where he was. And so he would walk up to us, and he would be like, how you doing? And so he would do kind of the pleasantries. And then he would kind of like lock in. And he'd be like, how is it with your soul? That's a big question, right? But it was such a cool thing. Again, kind of looking back and thinking about it now, it's like, hey, I'm not concerned about the shallow stuff. Let's get to a place where we can really talk about what's going on in our life. So anyway, I sent him a text. How you doing? How's the last problem that we talked about? Because there was a thing that we were talking about that he's going through. How's it going with that? And then the third thing was, are you reading the book of John like we talked about? Because that was kind of the plan that we made. And it was just such a cool thing. And because then he responded with, everything's good. Problem, I'm not struggling with the problem anymore. And then I'm trying to read the book of John. It was such a cool thing. And it's simple, right? Relationships, it's effort, but it's not hard, right? We should be willing to, but none of that takes place if we're not intentional about reaching out to other people and then also allowing other people to invest in our life. And so it makes me think about the men's small group. We've shameless plug, right? We've got small groups going on at the church currently. But I caught the tail end of the men's small group last week and kind of just snuck in and sat down, and I tried to be quiet, and apparently that doesn't work for me. So they wrapped it up. It was really cool. They wrapped it up after kind of the content, and they wrapped it up by going around the circle of these guys and answering these 3 questions. How did you feed your spirit this week? How did you feed your flesh this week? And who else did you feed this week? And I was like, there's not a formula to community, but that's a pretty good place to start. It's like we're sharing with others like what we did to actively grow our relationship with God. We're sharing with others what we did to sabotage our relationship with God. And when you have to verbalize that, it makes you not want to do the things that you did to sabotage your relationship with God. And then lastly, it makes us, again, focus on other people. Who did you feed this week? How many times have you made it through an entire week and did very little or nothing for anybody else? Right? Happens way more often than we'd like to admit. But when you've got to admit that and tell a group of people that you're not doing anything for anybody else, it probably the next week will make you start to consider other people as we should be doing, right? And so obviously, kind of the takeaway from all of this is that we are to be involved, engaged in community. Like, church is important, obviously. Like, I love church. I think church is one of the greatest entities on the face of the earth. But really, church is just kind of, it's the gateway, right? Community is the goal. That's what we're after. And so definitely be engaged in community. So that's our first disengage, community disengagement. Last one is this. And this may sound weird. You're at church. It's a Christian church. Like, we're a Jesus church. People are all, like, I get so weirded out. I get frustrated when people are like, well, what kind of church are you? I was like, I don't know, just like a Jesus church. We read the Bible and we do that stuff. And people are always just trying to get you tripped up on something. It's like, well, I don't like the way you do classes about baptism or some weird thing. So anyway, that's not a true story at all. So this point may seem weird, but I hope that it makes sense when we kind of make our way through it. And I think one of the things that we can do, one of the traps that we can fall in, is we can find ourselves disengaging from Jesus. It's so weird to think that you could go to church and be disengaged from Jesus. It's so weird to think that even like kind of large swaths of Christianity have all of the exterior trappings and have all of the appearances of Christianity, but they aren't really connected to the person of Jesus. And so kind of, I guess, specifically, let's look at, there are some similarities between this point and the first point. The first one being that becoming a follower of Jesus can become very performative. And what happens so often is we like to check boxes. I'm a list person. I love lists. Sometimes I make a list after I've done the things that I've done so that I can check a list. Like I can check a box. It's like, well, this is what I did, just so everybody knows what I did, right? And so I can check that box. And I think that carries over sometimes into our relationship with God. It's like, well, I went to church, check, and I read my Bible, check, and I prayed, check, and I tithed, check. And sometimes we do all of these things without ever really considering the Christ of Christianity, right? We do the Christian things without really kind of considering how Christ is affected by the things that we do and how he is the driving force of all of the things that we do. And this is not a new problem. This isn't a modern problem. This is an age-old problem. There has been a struggle with disconnecting the activity from the God who drives the activity since probably the beginning of time. But let's go all the way back to the New Testament. There was a group of people in Jesus' time called the Pharisees. Now, here's what's fascinating about the Pharisees. The Pharisees, in terms of activity and morality, they were flawless. There were 613 commandments in the Old Testament that they had to keep, and they kept them perfectly. Like, if you missed one, if there was one law that you didn't keep perfectly, you could not be a Pharisee. So they were, in terms of all of the external activities that they deemed godly, they were kind of flawless. And the things that they were doing, they were good things. It's not like the things weren't good. It's just that you've disconnected the things that you're doing from the person that you're doing them for. And that's where we kind of tend, again, this disengagement. I think about it like this. So the verb isn't as important as the noun that it's attached to. It's like what you do, that's great. Who you're doing it for, that's even more important. So let's look at what the Pharisees, this is what Jesus said about the Pharisees. Matthew chapter 23, verses 2 through 4, it says this: the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. So he's kind of setting it up. It's like, hey, look, these are the people in authority, so you should respect them. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. This is my favorite. So there's further down in Matthew chapter 23, there's 7 woes, and it's the woes to the Pharisees. And anytime Jesus is giving you a woe, it's not good, right? Like, I think we've got a modern woe and a biblical woe, and I don't want any biblical woes. The biblical woes are not good. So one of the woes is Matthew chapter 23, verses 23 and 24. It says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. This is Jesus talking, by the way. Like, just because we do this weird thing where it's like Jesus never said anything mean or straightforward or what we would consider harsh. And he's like, hey, teachers of the law, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. I'm not 100% sure what that means, but it's probably not good. Strain out a gnat, but you swallowed a camel. It's actually really fascinating if you dive into that, which we're not going to do. So a couple of things about this passage. The first thing is he's criticizing them to a degree where it says you give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. So not only would they tithe, like these people would tithe even the stuff that they got in terms of inventory, right? So their spices, they would even tithe off of their spices. They tithe off of their spices, but they don't really focus on justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And it's like, don't do the thing without considering who you're doing the thing for. And that's kind of what you find with them. And so I love how just a little bit further down, it says, you should have practiced the latter. It's fine that you want to be very detailed in the things that you do, and you want to focus on some of the kind of, again, the externalities, but don't do that at the cost of who you're doing it for. You should have focused on the latter, or should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. And I think that's what we do. It's like we kind of, it's one or the other. It's not both, when it should actually, in reality, be both. I saw a video the other day, and I promise I will not make this about football more than it needs to be about football. So I was watching a video, and it was a guy he was a motivational speaker, and he was about to go on stage, and it just so happened that Tim Tebow was also there, and he was about to give a speech, and so they were talking kind of beforehand, and the guy was like, getting ready, and Tebow comes up to him. By the way, people used to say I look like Tebow, but my response was, in fact, we were at a restaurant one time. Somebody bought our dinner because they thought I was Tim Tebow. It was so dope. It was really cool. But I'm like, the only difference is about 3 inches, 40 pounds of muscle, and zeros in my bank account. That's the only difference. So he was about to give a speech, and so Tebow comes up to him, and he's like, hey, what are you going to talk about? Kind of give me the details. And so it was cool because they just started chopping it up, started talking. And so it was fascinating because out of that kind of comes this concept. And so he's telling him, every coach gives you a playbook, right? So what it is when you get the playbook, that is the coach's mind on paper. And he gives it to you so that you know what he's thinking and you know what he expects and you know what he wants you to do in specific circumstances and situations. And then it was really cool because he made the shift, and he was like, and it's not just about the coach and the playbook and football. It's about life, right? God has given us this playbook, and the playbook is so that we know how to respond in the situations and the things that we go through. Because we know him, because we know his heart, we know what he would want us to do in the things that we go through. And so to me, that kind of sums it up perfectly, right? It's not as much about the execution, but the intention. It's about getting to know him, and when you get to know him, then you know the things that he wants you to do. And when you focus on the things instead of the person, I think that's where you run into some of the problems. If you're so focused on the plays and not about what the coach wants you to do, that's where you would run into some of these particular problems. The goal is to try to know the coach so well that we would naturally do what he wants us to do as a result of the strength of the relationship. Does that make sense? Like God is that coach, right? And he's given us this playbook. And the point is not just to run the plays. The point is we know him so well that we're going to do the things that he wants us to do in the season or situation that we find ourselves in. And when you start to break this down, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I think about my own personal life. I think about there are relationships, there are a few people in my life that I believe I know well enough that I could predict with, let's say, 99% accuracy that the thing that I'm going to do, is it going to be helpful to them or is it going to be harmful to our relationship? And that all comes from what? I know them, and I know what they like, and I know what they expect, and I know what their goals are. And if I'm going to do something, I know, because I know them, if this is helpful or this is harmful. And so I think the same thing is true of God. It's like once you start to know him, then you begin to know him, right? And I think there's a big difference between, like, we learn about him, and that leads us to start to know him. And I think social media kind of, like, gives us a really good insight as to what this looks like. How many times have you met somebody and it's like, oh, hey, we're friends on Facebook? That's never happened to you? Cool. That happens to me all the time. Like, it's so weird. It's like I meet somebody, like, in person. We're already friends. And it's like, maybe I learned about him through that thing, but now I have the opportunity to actually know the person. And I think that's kind of the progress or the process, the way it works with God. It's like you can learn about him. Going to church and reading your Bible and all those things are amazing because you start to learn about God, but you learn about God so that you can know him. And when you know him, you know what he wants you to do. You know how he wants you to respond. You know how he wants you to live and the decisions that he wants you to make because you know him, and you can predict with certainty the decision you're about to make. Is it going to be helpful to that relationship, or is it going to be harmful to that relationship? What tends to happen, unfortunately, like we kind of, again, we probably know these things, but unfortunately what tends to happen is we tend to focus on the measurables and the metrics because we like to check the boxes, right? It's a lot harder to say, like, how do you gauge your relationship with Jesus without some of the measurables and the metrics? Like, we can check, I read my Bible, I prayed, I went to church, I did this and that and the other. I served somebody else. I thought about somebody else. I texted somebody else. I asked them how they were doing. Like, we did all of the things attached to Christianity. But so often it happens, like, we do the things attached to Christianity without knowing the Christ of Christianity and without thinking about how he factors into the decisions that we make. And so all of the extra stuff is important. Like, let's not, Jesus even made that clear. He's like, hey, you should do all of that stuff, but also don't neglect the other stuff. Don't neglect, for us in this specific context, don't neglect the person who you're doing it for. So my prayer for us is that we stay engaged with Jesus more than we do the work we do for him. Like, the work you do for God is important. Like, the things you do for God is important. But it's never more important than your relationship with God. Like, if you, here's what happens, I believe. I suspect one of two things will happen. If you become more focused, more engaged with the activity and the things than you do with your relationship with God. Is one day you'll wake up and you'll realize that you've spent years focusing on the wrong things. And the danger with that is like, once you're that invested, it's really hard to change. Because like, think about the humility that's got to come, and you would be willing to admit that you've lived your life the wrong way for years. Makes it really hard to change, right? I think that's one thing that may happen. And the second thing is that I think you'll just grow tired of the performance. I think you'll grow. This is where I think so many people, they do disconnect because they've been disengaged. And so I think disconnection can come from disengagement. You just get tired of going through the motions. You get tired of doing all of this stuff, and you get tired because you're not connected to the source of the things that you're doing. You're not connected to the source of your purpose. And so if we're doing all of these things and we're not considering Jesus and how he factors in, we're not doing it for him. Maybe you've gotten to a place where you do the stuff so that other people will think you're, awesome or some type of way, as they say. I don't know what that means, but it's a thing. So at the end of the day, my prayer is this, is like, as we learn more about God, I pray that leads to us knowing him better, that would be the driving force of the things that we do, the decisions that we make, the way that we live, all of our actions and all of the things that essentially comprise our life. I pray that we do those things not just for the activity. We don't do it just to check boxes, but we do it because we're doing it for Jesus. We're trying to connect our lives to him. We're trying to be so well connected to him, to know him so well, that we live lives that honor him, that please him, and reflect him in the world that we live. Amen. Let me pray for us. Jesus, thank you so much. Thank you for giving us this clear directive in terms of community. God, that we're not built to do this alone. God, maverick Christianity is not a thing. God, that we need each other. And just like your commandment says, God, that we love each other, that we sacrifice for one another, that we lay down our lives for each other. And God, this is your demonstration of love for us, and it's a mantle that we're supposed to pick up and carry. God, I pray that you would help us to do that. But God, with that and anything else that we do for you, I pray that we remember why we're doing it, who we're doing it for, that we don't go through the motions, that we don't get caught in the trap of performance or checklists or to-do lists or any of those other things. But God, that we would do it for you because we love you and we know you and we're learning more and more about you. God, I pray that the decisions that we make are a result of our knowledge of who you are, your character, God, that you can be trusted, your love for us, all of these things that we're learning about you. God, I pray that they would drive the decisions that we make, the way that we live, God, the interactions that we have, everything as a result of our connection to you. God, that we never put the emphasis on the what, but always on the who. Jesus, we're so thankful for everything that you've done for us. And we pray these things in your incredible name. Amen.